In the previous videos, we've spent our time actually configuring security on our PyData archive following a custom plan for our organization. But how did we come up with this plan in the first place? Well, that's what we'll be focusing on in this video, how to plan out a security model for your organization. And we even have a supporting spreadsheet that you can use as an aid. Let's take a look at that. I'll open the spreadsheet up here and walk you through how I use this sheet to come up with my custom security plan. Keep in mind, the spreadsheet is only designed as a tool to help you with this online course. You'll notice that there's a couple questions that it's going to ask us right up front. Essentially, we need to figure out what are the different groups at our company that use the Pi system, and what are the different types of data that are stored in it. When it comes to coming up with the different groups and the different types of data, keep in mind, this might be a little bit of an iterative process. You might think of a few and then realize you're going to break it down to some smaller groups. In our case, what I was looking at is identifying what were those different Windows groups that we have at our company. In our case, as we saw in the previous videos, we have a Pi administrators group, we have process engineering teams that there's both the leads and the engineers themselves, and we also have a consultants group, and essentially everyone at our company, all of our employees, can use the Pi system. So this is a good starting point, figuring out what are some of those groups, because then we can leverage these when we plan out our security model. So let's go ahead and write down some of the groups and individuals that we know that we have. For example, our Pi administrators, or our process engineering team, as well as those who lead our process engineering team. And we also know all of our employees and consultants. Okay, so those are some different groups that we were able to think of at our organization. What about the different types of data stored in our Pi system? In this case, let me reference our Pi points so we get an idea of how we might break this down. Remember, on our PyData archive, we have some process-related Pi points, specifically for our pumps. We use the ping interface to tell us some information, so maybe we could classify this as, IT or Pi system health related. And there's also default Pi points on our system. That could also be used for testing, just to confirm that the system is operating properly. Okay, so let's go and add some of the different data types. So we know we have our process Pi points, and we also have our IT or Pi system health Pi points. We've got our default Pi points. And part of what we're doing here is thinking about, are there subsets of data that shouldn't be viewed by some of the groups that we've identified that use our Pi system? Remember, we have a consultants group, and our consultants group only needs to see a very specific type of data. So let's go ahead and write down the type of data that they'll need to see. And actually, let's also make sure we spell consultants right. Okay, so our consultants are only going to be dealing with our Pump 5 asset. So I'll write that. Okay, great. I have my groups and my different types of data. Let's take a look at what else we need. This second part is really focusing on the permissions for our data. And you'll see that it's telling us to select the type of data from our drop-down list, which is right here. And this is pre-populated with the entries that we just added above. So let's focus on the first one, our process PyPoints. Now for the selected data type, now we'll need to answer some questions. These ones down here. And the first is, do they need to see the data values for these PyPoints? Now, what's the they in this question? Well, if you look over here, we can see that our groups have been added into these different columns. And so we'll be answering the questions for each group. For example, the first one for our PyAdministrators. Let's take a look at, make sure, okay, so all of the groups that we added got listed here. All right, PyAdministrators. Do our PyAdministrators need to see data for our PyPoints? In this case, yes, our PyAdministrators need complete visibility to everything in our Py system. Now, what about our process engineers? Definitely, because those are our process PyPoints, and our process engineering leads, of course. In our case, we've made the decision to make this type of data available to everyone, so I'll go ahead and say yes. And when I said everyone, I was specifically thinking about our employees, because the answer for consultants is no. As I made these choices, you can see we're starting to pre-populate some information down below. But first, we'll need to finish answering the rest of the questions. So let's take a look over here. Next, we need to identify, will they need to edit the data values for these PyPoints, or modify which identities can see the data. So potentially which new users will be able to see this data. Now this is something that's very specific to only our PyAdministrators and our process engineering leads. Those are the only groups that would be involved for setting those up. And similarly, with the next question, what about the remaining PyPoint configuration? Well, in that case, it's the same. Just our PyAdministrators and our process engineering leads. So let me answer the rest of the questions here. So yes, and the other one's no, and similarly yes, and yes. Okay, so now that we have answered all these questions for our process PyPoints, you can see that there's corresponding strings of permissions here, and these permissions then get added to these two. Let's take a look at that output. What we can see here is they're being combined for our data security and our point security for this particular group of PyPoints. Remember, our process PyPoints. It also has some instructions to copy to corresponding cell below. So let's scroll down and figure out which cells those are. Okay, so it's the ones that are color-coded the same. So we started with our process PyPoints, and now we'll just copy the data security down to the data security. Now when I copy, I'm going to right-click and hit copy, and then right-click and paste values. I want to paste values because otherwise we'll just get the formula that we use to build the spreadsheet and do all these things automatically for us. And then I'll right-click on the next one, copy, right-click, paste just the values. Okay, so that looks good. So this is for our process PyPoints. Now let's go back up here and proceed with the next data type, our IT PySystem Health PyPoints. Now, as I selected this, all of our answers still show the previous one. So an easy way to clear that out is I can select and copy this one and paste it across all of these to reset it. So I'll right-click and paste this time. All right. Now I can go through the process for my IT Pi System Health Pi points. Since I've got the questions figured out and the process down, I'm going to speed up a little bit as I answer the questions again for each data type and copy them down here. Okay, so now that we have gone through and copied this for each of our different Pi point types, we've completed this table down here. But first, let's move on to our next questions, which are really focused around the database security tables access. So here, we can see that it's asking us a series of questions about some of the database security permissions that will be required, again, for our different user groups. Now, these questions have grouped related database security areas together, but keep in mind, you can break it down by each individual area on the database security table. Let's look at the questions that are going to help us sort some of this out. The first one is, do they need to see data for one or more Pi point? Everybody needed to see data for one or more Pi point. So you can see by default, it's going to say yes for all the groups that we have up here. Now the next one is asking about what is going to be some of their roles. For example, if there's an issue with data flow, are they going to need to do some Pi Data Archive system checks, try to look at the configuration, to do some troubleshooting? Maybe not necessarily making changes, but do they need to be able to see how things are set up and what state they're in? So in our case, our Pi administrators are obviously going to need this, but those who are involved on our process engineering team have familiarity with the Pi system, and they would actually do this. So we're going to say yes for them. On the other hand, our business users aren't involved with how the Pi system is actually set up. They just consume data. So in that case, it would be no for them, as well as our consultants. The next question is about, do they need to set up new Pi interfaces or edit the configuration of existing ones? Similarly to the Pi point configuration that we just specified, this is a task that would be for our Pi administrators or our process engineering leads at our company. So we'll specify yes, and then yes for the process engineering leads as well. All right. Now, next question. Do they need to perform Pi administration tasks like configuring security or backups or archives, adjusting tuning parameters? That's something that just our Pi system administrators group will handle. So yes for our Pi administrators, but no for everyone else. And the final question is regarding the MDB. If somebody is going to need permissions regarding the MDB for things that are not Pi interface, as well as for auditing or batch, we don't use those in our system, so I'm just going to leave everybody as no, including our Pi administrators. But let's say that we did, so we'll go ahead and say yes for our Pi administrators in case we start using those. All right, so it looks like we have all the questions answered, and the final results are presented down here in these two tables. For our Pi points here, we now have security strings for data security as well as point security that we can take to Pi Builder. And if you take a look at how things are set up, essentially for all of our data, that's our process data, anyone at our company is able to see it, but only our Pi administrators and our process engineering leads are going to deal with the configuration of the Pi points. On our Pump 5 Pi points in particular, our consultants group will be able to see these as well, but they won't be able to see any other Pi points on our system. Again, the default Pi points everybody can see, and the IT Pi system health Pi points everyone can see at our company, but we're only going to let our Pi administrators make configuration changes. So we'll see that for data security and mirrored for point security here. Now, the bottom table deals with what are some identities and database security table permissions we'll need. In this case, we're going to be leveraging our groups and creating custom Pi identities. That's why these settings will work for our Pi points. Now, for our Pi administrators, we're going to be mapping them to the Pi admin's identity because that has read-write on everything by default on new Pi systems. And we also will be creating custom identities for our other users. In this case, process engineers, process engineering leads, all company, and consultants. And from there, when it comes to the database security table, we'll see read for our process engineers, and then our process engineering leads are going to need some additional ones on Pi point, Pi DS, and Pi modules that will allow the process engineering leads to create new Pi points or create new Pi interfaces. And finally, when it comes to everyone at our company being able to see data, that would be read on the Pi point database security table, as well as the digital sets if that's used for Pi points, but it's basically implicitly granted with Pi point read. Okay, so this is how you can work through and plan out for your users what mapping should I create to the specific Windows groups, and what are the database security table areas and Pi points that they should be granted access to. And again, you can do even more breakdown on the database security table. These were just some of the areas that we chose to focus on. Now, what about our applications? We saw in the earlier videos we use the same methodology, creating mappings for our Pi SDK and AF SDK applications, and then trusts, on the other hand, for our Pi API applications, namely Pi interfaces. So this second tab down here is going to help us with reminding us for the permissions needed for some of those applications. So let's take a look at that here. So when I navigate to Applications tab, we'll see that this is going to remind us the permissions for our Pi interfaces and buffering, depending on our configuration, as well as Pi core site. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is list out the Pi interfaces that we're using to send the data, and this is how I could fill out the information and figure out what are the needed permissions for our Pi interfaces and buffering, like how we did in the previous videos. So in my case, I'm using the Pi interface for OPC-DA, as well as the Pi interface for ping. Okay, and I could write additional interfaces if I'm using them, but as soon as I did, the interfaces are getting listed in these columns. And you can see the first question we'll need to answer for them is if we're going to buffer the data, because depending on whether or not the data is buffered will reflect different minimum security permissions for our interfaces. Since it's a good idea to buffer the data in case the Pi data archive goes down, we're using buffering for both. So I'll say yes, and then yes here. Now once I do, it's going to ask me for the service account that we're running the Pi buffer subsystem in our case in. So I'll go ahead and just write that down here. So I'll have that noted. Okay, and then it's going to tell me these are the needed permissions for the Pi buffering mapping that I can create for this particular service account. And I'm actually going to be using the same here. So I've got the permissions mapped out for buffering. Now the next part is going to ask information about the interface that I can use to configure the trust. So I'll go ahead and fill out the location, IP, and the API connection name. Again, these were all the fields that we use for our trusts. And then the final question that I'll need to answer is whether or not that the interface has output points. In my case, my interfaces do not have output points. So I'll go ahead and say no. And for this one as well. And once I did, it tells me this is the permissions that the identity specified in my Pi interface trust is going to need, and I'll build the trust with this information here. And just as to show you what would look like if you're in different positions, for example, if we said no, then we'd have additional permissions needed for our Pi interface trust, or if we said that we have output points, we'd have additional permissions needed for output points. So just some examples, but this will tell us right away how we can go ahead and set up our trust and our mapping for our Pi interface and for Pi buffer subsystem. And finally, if we're using Pi CoreSite, which we are, we can go ahead and specify the service account that will be running our Pi CoreSite app pools and Pi Web API crawler under, and that will let us know the permissions we'll need for our Pi CoreSite mapping. Okay, so again, we would create a Pi CoreSite mapping for this service account, and we give it these database security permissions and these Pi point permissions. So this is a good way to plan out some of the basic applications security permissions and go ahead and set up mappings and trusts for them. Now, if you have additional applications that read data from or write data to your Pi data archive, you'll need to consult our individual product documentation, which will remind you about here. With that, I hope you can see that these are the types of questions you will need to ask as you develop a custom security plan for your organization. Your model will be based on what applications you use, what types of data do you have, and the unique needs of the different groups at your organization. Now it's time for you to put these concepts into action and develop a custom security model for your organization as part of your final project in this class. Additionally, if you want to see what the end result of these permissions in action looks like, check out our video, which is a demo of custom Pi Data Archive security in action.